It wasn't raining that day, but it felt like it should have been. The kind of gray morning where the sky hangs too low and everything sounds muffled, like the world's holding its breath. I walked into her office with a cup of black coffee and a bulletproof smile, expecting 10 minutes of small talk about client metrics or budget cuts. Instead, I found silence and a printout, my resume, from a job I hadn't even accepted yet. Just an application, just curiosity. She didn't greet me, didn't look up, just nudged the paper toward me with a manicured finger like she was presenting evidence in a trial. And I was already convicted. "I thought we had a future here," she said, voice flat, rehearsed, "but it seems you were planning yours somewhere else. 6 years? 6 years of arriving early, leaving late, giving her credit for ideas she barely understood, covering for her slip-ups, and smiling through meetings where she took the glory while I took the notes. 6 years boiled down to a single sheet of paper. I didn't explain. There was nothing to say that would have mattered. She didn't want understanding. She wanted obedience. I gave her silence. She called HR, told them to start the termination process. They moved with the efficiency of people who had done this before. And recently, one came in with a box. One stayed behind to observe. Eyes on me like I was a security risk, not a strategist. I remember looking at that box and thinking how small it looked, how neatly it could contain 6 years of my life, a few notepads, a framed quote from my father, a pen I liked. That was it. That's all I was allowed to take. That, and the silence I refused to break. They walked me out, no goodbyes, no scene. I didn't make eye contact with anyone. I didn't want to see the pity, or, worse, the relief. Outside, the sunlight hit me square in the face. Sharp, unfiltered. I hadn't noticed how long it had been since I felt the sun without the tint of an office window. The warmth was jarring, like I was waking up, like my body had remembered something my mind hadn't. I was free. At home. I set the box down on the kitchen counter. My apartment was quiet, cleaner than it should have been, like I'd been too busy to live in it. I looked at the contents of that box and didn't feel rage. I didn't feel sadness. I felt air. Like the weight had shifted off my shoulders and into the room. My phone buzzed. A text from Tessa, my closest friend. The only one who ever really saw how hard I worked behind that woman's throne. "What the hell? You okay?" I didn't respond. I just stared at the text, then set the phone down. I wasn't okay, but I wasn't broken either. I was still. Stillness was something I hadn't felt in years. That night, I didn't cry. I didn't drink. I didn't call anyone. I sat on my couch, legs tucked beneath me, watching the sky darken. My mind wandered to that moment in her office, her eyes flat and cold, her words clipped. She hadn't even asked why I applied. She didn't care about the reason, only the fact that I dared to consider another life. In her mind, ambition was betrayal. Loyalty meant stagnation, and growth was insubordination. She didn't fire me for disloyalty. She fired me for wanting more, and that's the part she never understood. Some people leave with anger, some leave with regrets, but I didn't leave. She pushed me on, and I let her. Because sometimes the most strategic move isn't to fight the system, it's to let it eject you so you can build something better with the momentum of your fall. By midnight, I had already deleted my work email from my phone. The next morning, I woke up without an alarm for the first time in years. No anxiety pit in my stomach, no racing heart. I made myself coffee, strong, dark, and slow. I sipped it in silence. It tasted like peace. And then the phone rang. Not hers, not Tessa's. A number I didn't recognize. One that hadn't called before. When I answered, I didn't expect what came next. The voice on the other end was smooth, direct, and unmistakably powerful. Ms. Alcott. A pause. This is Mark Vellner, CEO of Atria. I stood in my kitchen, holding the phone to my ear, coffee cooling in my other hand. Atria, the company I had quietly interviewed with last week. The one whose offer I never got the chance to receive. I remembered walking into their high-rise, sleek and understated, the kind of place where people didn't need to shout to be heard. I understand you're no longer with Braden and Co., he said. Not a question, a statement. I told him that was correct. Good, he said. That simplifies things. Another pause. The silence felt deliberate, not awkward. He was a man who chose his words the way surgeons choose their tools, clean, precise, intentional. I'd like to meet you this afternoon. No second interviews, no panels, just a direct conversation. You've been vetted, I blinked, for a position, for a role that didn't exist until this morning. He said, but after what I heard about your exit and what we already know about your work, I'd be remiss not to act. I didn't ask how he knew. I didn't ask what he heard. People talk. People listen. Sometimes, the silence after a betrayal is louder than 1,000 resumes. I agreed to meet him at 3. I had nothing to lose. And more importantly, I had no one left to please. The office was nothing like my old one. There were no glass trophies or fake smiles, just sharp architecture and quiet urgency. Mark was younger than I expected, early 40s, perhaps, but with eyes that had seen enough to make youth irrelevant. He didn't offer me water or coffee. He offered me a chair. I don't want to waste your time. He said, you were let go because your ambition made someone else uncomfortable. I find that valuable. I studied him. His face gave nothing away. But his words hit like small detonations. I need someone who sees the game before it's played. Who knows how to move pieces without tipping the board? You've already done that, quietly, strategically. Even your silence speaks volumes. I sat straighter. What exactly is the role I asked? You tell me, he said. What would you do here if you had complete authority to shape a new division? It was a question meant to test me, but it didn't feel like a trap. It felt like permission. So I answered. For the next 20 minutes, I laid out a framework for a department that could rethink client relations from the ground up, one that didn't just respond to crises but anticipated them, one that didn't sell strategy but became it. He didn't take notes, he just watched me. And when I finished, he stood, held out his hand, and said, "Welcome to Atria." Just like that, no contracts, no formalities. Trust before paperwork. A test of character. One I passed because I had nothing left to fake. I walked out of that office with no offer letter in hand, but the weight of something heavier purpose. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't walking away from something. I was walking into it. 3 days later, I sat at my new desk, smaller than my last, but more mine. No one glanced at me like I was intruding. No one whispered in corners. People here were too focused on moving forward. And I liked that. I could move in silence, unnoticed, until the day they realized who I'd become. That same afternoon, a whisper found its way into my inbox. A forwarded email from my former company's board of directors. They were trying to reach me. Not through HR, not through my ex-boss, directly. The subject line said, "Let's talk." I didn't reply. That night, I opened the message and read it twice. It was everything I expected, a mixture of apology, regret, and veiled panic. They wanted to discuss my exit. They had reevaluated the situation. They were committed to making amends. The board was unaware of the full context. They wanted to fix it. Fix it. Like they could slap a bandage over 6 years in a 6-minute dismissal. But what they didn't understand was this. I didn't want to be invited back. I wanted to stay gone. Because sometimes the real power isn't in returning to the table. It's in building your own and making sure they never get a seat. I didn't delete the email, I archived it. Not because I planned to respond, but because I wanted the reminder. A digital fossil of what desperation looks like when pride collapses. They didn't miss me. They missed what I covered for, what I carried, what I shielded. There's a difference. By Friday, the emails doubled, then a call, then another. Tessa texted me screenshots of LinkedIn posts from some of my old colleagues. Miss her brilliance already. One of the best minds I've worked with. I almost laughed. They were memorializing me like I had died, not moved on. But I said nothing. Let them write elegies. I was too busy building something the dead don't get to touch. It was around this time that Mark called me into a glass-walled conference room and shut the door. He held a folder thick, clipped, and embossed with a name I hadn't seen in days. Braden & Co. We're reevaluating our partnerships, he said. Your old firm is up for review. I said nothing. He flipped the folder open. They're up for renewal on a 2-year contract worth just under $7 million. But their last quarterly report is weak. Deliverables slipping, client churn increasing. I nodded slowly. My heartbeat didn't change. I want your input, he said. Not just on the numbers, like on the people. You know how they think it would have been easy? So easy. All I had to do was nod, draw a red circle around the weaknesses, and let the ground fall out beneath them. But I didn't. Instead, I asked for 2 days. I spent them reviewing documents, pulling past interactions from my memory like evidence in a silent trial. I didn't weaponize the truth, I documented it. I didn't exaggerate, I highlighted patterns. And when I returned to that conference room, I didn't pitch revenge. I presented facts. This partnership, I said, once had potential. But now, it's a liability dressed in legacy. They're leaning on a reputation they no longer uphold. The work is late. The strategy is hollow. And the only thing they're managing well is denial. Mark didn't smile. He just nodded once. A week later, I saw the news in a press release. Atria had selected a new partner agency, one with leaner operations, faster turnarounds, and no ties to the past. Braden & Co. wasn't mentioned. They weren't even thanked. But I didn't need a headline. I got my closure in the form of silence, the kind that follows a closed door, the kind that echoes. Tessa called me that night, her voice buzzing with disbelief. They're panicking, she said. Your name is practically banned over there. She's been in meetings all week. Someone said she looked like she hadn't slept in days. I didn't respond right away. I let the words settle. Then I asked, did they say why? Oh, everyone knows, she said. They lost the Atria account. That was 1/3 of their revenue. And now the other clients are asking questions. I said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Some people crave vindication. I didn't. I wasn't trying to win. I wasn't trying to be seen. I was simply correcting a narrative that never deserved to survive. She had painted me as disloyal, unstable, ambitious to a fault. Now, without a single word from me, the canvas was blank again, and the truth was painting itself, stroke by silent stroke. 2 days later, a courier arrived at my apartment. No name on the envelope, but I recognized the handwriting on the card inside. It was hers. 6 sentences, all lowercase, no greeting, no sign-off. I should have listened. I moved too fast. I know you won't respond, but I needed to say this. You were never the problem. I was scared of being outshined. You deserved better. I read it once. Then I folded it in half and slipped it into a drawer I rarely opened. Because some apologies aren't for closure. They're just the sound of power shifting hands. The card stayed in the drawer, untouched. I never reread it. I didn't need to. I had already memorized the rhythm of her regret, 6 brittle sentences masquerading as atonement. What she wanted was forgiveness without confrontation, an unearned peace offering. But the thing about silence is, once you master it, you don't break it for anything that can't hold its own weight. I didn't gloat. I didn't forward her message to Tessa. I didn't share it over wine with laughter in my throat. Instead, I sat in my apartment that night, barefoot on cold tile, and watched a candle burn down to its base. There's something cleansing about watching fire consume what's no longer needed, soft wax collapsing into itself. A quiet surrender. That was how it felt to let go. Not loud, not triumphant, just clean. A week later, I stood in front of a boardroom full of senior executives at Atria, presenting a strategy shift that would reroute nearly $30 million in future investments. I spoke clearly, precisely, without overreaching. I didn't dress the part of someone needing to prove herself. I dressed like someone who belonged. And they noticed. After the meeting, Mark approached me as the room cleared. He didn't compliment me. He didn't pat my back. He just said, "Keep building." I nodded. That was all I needed. But success has its own echo, and it started reverberating in places I hadn't anticipated. 2 weeks after that presentation, I received a message from a recruiter, not just any recruiter, but one who used to court Braden & Co.'s top talent. She wanted to talk about public speaking events, keynote panels, even a possible column in a leadership journal. My name was gaining weight, not because I shouted, but because I didn't. Because in a world of loud exits, I had made mine so quiet that people leaned in to listen harder. Meanwhile, the headlines surrounding my former firm grew less flattering. A minor exodus of talent, a missed campaign deadline for a major client, whispers of reorganization. I never reached out. I didn't need to. When you remove the linchpin, the collapse is inevitable. You don't have to pull anything down. Gravity does it for you. And yet, I wasn't celebrating. There was no playlist of revenge songs playing in the background of my life. There was just rhythm, a steady unfolding of what happens when truth is left undisturbed long enough to rise to the surface. Sometimes, I thought about her, the woman who sat across from me that day, and read my ambition as treason. I wondered what she told herself each morning as she passed the office where I used to sit. If she rearranged the narrative to soften her part in it. If she blamed the board, HR, anyone but the mirror. It didn't matter. By then, I had been invited into closed-door strategy sessions, had my insights circulated across departments, and was quietly mentoring a woman from a different team who reminded me of myself before the fall sharp, cautious, too generous with her silence. I didn't tell her to be ruthless. I just told her to remember, to document, to never confuse being the quiet one with being the disposable one. In time, the phone calls from Braden & Co. stopped, the emails faded, even the apologies dried up, because eventually, even regret gets tired of being ignored. That was the real victory, not her collapse, not their panic, but the shift in my own narrative. I was no longer a footnote in someone else's empire. I was the architect of my own, and that changed everything. I started walking to work, not every day. Just enough to remember what the world sounded like without a badge beep or elevator music in my ears. Morning sidewalks were my new boardroom, clean slates wrapped in sunrise. I passed the same bakery on 9th Street, where the owner always dusted flour from her sleeves to wave. She didn't know who I was. She didn't care what I used to do. And that anonymity felt like freedom. Atria kept growing. So did I. My name started appearing on internal memos, then public project briefs. I got used to seeing it in places I didn't expect. CC lines, calendar invites, tentative panels for industry summits. There was no press release announcing my arrival, no LinkedIn post celebrating a new title, but I didn't need applause. I just needed space. And I had it. What people often misunderstand about revenge is that it isn't always about taking someone down. Sometimes it's about rising in full view, untouched, unimpressed, and undeniably out of reach. That's what I became, the question mark in their silence, the name they couldn't say without tasting regret. One afternoon, in a client debrief, someone from the new partner agency leaned in during a break and said, "You used to be at Braden. Right, what happened?" I met her eyes for half a second. "I outgrew the structure," I said. That was all. No venom, no salt, just the truth elegantly stated. But even truth delivered gently can echo louder than a scream. That night, I opened the drawer where her letter sat and slid it behind a stack of tax documents. Not because I needed it gone, but because it had done its job. I didn't keep it to remember her. I kept it to remember myself, the version of me that stayed still while they tore her down, the one who endured without flinching. That kind of silence rewires you. It teaches you which parts of your voice they were most afraid of. A month later, I received a calendar invitation from Mark. No agenda, no subject line, just his name and the time. When I walked into his office, he stood at the window, back to the door. I didn't announce myself. He turned when he was ready. "I want you to take the lead on the overhaul," he said. My expression didn't shift. Which overhaul? The core operations internal structure, leadership flow, the bridge between divisions. It's going to redefine how we scale. He handed me a folder thicker than anything I'd seen. Inside were org charts, budget forecasts, timelines, but also something else: trust. Buried between the numbers was an unspoken acknowledgement that I had become indispensable, not because I made noise, but because I made impact. I left that office with a new mandate, quiet authority, unofficial power, the kind that doesn't need titles to walk into any room and be heard. And a week later, it happened. I ran into her, not in a meeting, not on purpose, at a coffee shop near the courthouse, of all places. She didn't see me at first. She was seated by the window, phone pressed to her ear, face tight with tension. Her nails were bitten down, unlike the pristine gloss I remembered. She looked older, not in years, but in wear. I ordered my coffee and turned to leave. That's when she saw me. For a moment, she froze. Then she smiled, a pale imitation of something warmer. She stood. "I've been meaning to reach out again," she said, voice too light. I said nothing. "I heard about Atria. Impressive work." She hesitated. "You look different." I nodded once. "I am." She waited, as if expecting me to fill the silence, to meet her halfway across some imaginary bridge. But I wasn't crossing. She began. But her voice caught. "You didn't deserve how that ended." I didn't thank her, because acknowledgement delayed is still just a shadow of the truth. "I know," I said, and walked past her, the bell above the door ringing as it closed behind me. The air outside was brisk, sharp enough to keep me present. I didn't look back. I didn't check the reflection in the shop window. I didn't need to. That moment had already passed, and I had no desire to retrieve it. There's a kind of quiet that follows you after you've said nothing, an invisible cloak of power that only those who've been underestimated truly understand. That day, walking away from her, I wore it like armor. Back at the office, I dove into the overhaul project. It wasn't about redesigning flowcharts or rewriting procedure documents. It was about recalibrating how power moved through a system, removing bottlenecks disguised as legacy, amplifying the voices that had been buried under bureaucracy. I didn't make speeches. I made space. One of the junior analysts, Layla, started leaving sticky notes on my desk. Not the annoying kind, but ones with sharp insights scribbled in a tight, looping hand. At first, I just nodded when I saw her in the hallway. Then I invited her into a strategy session. She didn't talk much, but when she did, every word had a point. I saw it in her eyes' recognition. The quiet hunger of someone who's learned not to speak unless it matters. The kind of woman I used to be before they fired me for wanting more. Over time, the internal culture shifted. Meetings became sharper. Dead weight resigned or adapted. I was never named chief anything. But when decisions were made, they moved through me. Not because I demanded it, but because I had proven I didn't need to. And still, the past found its way in. Late one night, while reviewing vendor audits, I noticed a familiar name in the pending proposals, an external contractor who had once been tightly aligned with Braden & Co., a man who once refused to take my input seriously in budget discussions, only to later pitch the same ideas through her, as if they were his own. He had submitted a bid, a high one, wrapped in jargon and puffed credentials. I could have shredded it with a single comment, flagged the inconsistencies, undermined the foundation, but instead, I did what I always do. I laid out the facts, not cost-effective. I wrote, inflated for scale, no added value, risk profile high. I signed it and moved on. 2 days later, the proposal was rejected. No drama, no fallout, just a door quietly shut in a hallway no one walked down anymore. That's the thing they never tell you about power. It isn't loud. It doesn't demand attention. It doesn't post receipts. Real power whispers in rooms where others raise their voices and still go unheard. Months passed. Seasons turned. Atria announced its expansion into new markets. I was asked to sit in on pre-launch sessions. Not as a guest, but as a builder. My fingerprints were on the blueprint now. Not visible, but essential. And then, almost exactly 1 year from the day I was fired, I got an envelope in the mail. No return address, no markings, just my name, written by hand. Inside was a folded clipping from a business journal, a small article about the restructuring at Braden & Co. It mentioned executive turnover, revenue decline, and a strategic rebranding to rebuild lost client trust. No one signed it. No note included. Just that single article. I held it between my fingers, studied the ink, then set it down beside my coffee and smiled. Not out of glee, but out of recognition. That what they once built by silencing voices like mine had begun to dissolve. And all I had to do was keep walking. The article stayed on my table for a full day before I tucked it under a stack of old client reports. Not to keep it, just to let it fade, like all things that outlived their relevance. I didn't frame it, didn't highlight the sentences about departing executives or loss of client confidence. I didn't need proof. I had memory. And memory, sharpened by clarity, never loses its edge. I thought about her less often now, not because I had forgiven, but because I had repurposed the energy. There's only so much room in a mind shaped by discipline, and mine had made space for bigger things: growth without guilt, success without spectacle, power without noise. But still, sometimes the past knocks not with apology, but with curiosity. One morning, Layla hesitated at my doorway. "Do you have a minute?" she asked, her voice quieter than usual. I nodded. She sat, hands folded tight in her lap. "Someone from Braden reached out. They're building a new team. Offered me a senior position, twice the salary." I watched her carefully. Her eyes were sharp, but uncertain. "Did they ask for silence?" I asked. She nodded. "They always do," I said. She waited for my opinion, but I didn't offer one. That wasn't my role anymore. I didn't shape people's paths, I illuminated what the path had cost me. So I said this: "You don't owe them your future just because they've now recognized your past." She nodded slowly. She understood. Not because I told her what to do, but because I spoke the language of scars. Later that week, I saw her email come through, the one declining the offer. And in her words, I recognized mine measured, firm, unapologetic. I didn't reply. I just archived it, smiling quietly. She didn't need validation. She had already chosen dignity over desperation. That was the shift no one could quantify in a quarterly report, the ripple effect of a woman who refused to burn down the house and instead built a better one next door. By the time spring rolled in, Atria had become unrecognizable from the place I first joined. The walls still stood, but the energy inside had changed. You could feel it in how people spoke less about legacy, more about vision, less about hierarchy, more about collaboration. And in the center of it all, not announced, not celebrated, just steady was me, at a company-wide summit. Mark stood on stage outlining the company's next phase. He talked about innovation, resilience, foresight. And then, without preamble, he said my name. No fanfare, just a statement. She built the system we now trust. Not loudly, but thoroughly. The applause was brief, respectful. But in that moment, I felt something shift not outside me, but within, a quiet settling of the soul. A knowing. I had become the woman they used to fear I might be, unafraid, unwavering, impossible to define through their lens. Later that evening, I left the venue and walked alone into the night air. It was cool, crisp, the sky sharp with stars. I thought about the girl who once sat across from a woman in power, accused of betrayal for simply wanting more. I thought about the silence that followed, and I thought about how sometimes the loudest victories are the ones no one hears but you. But that night, I didn't go straight home. I wandered, past the river where the buildings reflected themselves like they were unsure of who they were becoming, past the alley that used to scare me when I first moved here, before I learned that danger doesn't always wear shadows. Sometimes it wears heels, sits behind glass desks, and smiles while it slices. I found myself in front of the old Braden building, not on purpose, not to haunt old ghosts, just passing through. The lights were on, but dimmer now. The lobby no longer sparkled like it once did. The receptionist's desk was unmanned. I stood across the street, watching for a few quiet seconds. Then I turned away. That was the last thread, and I didn't need to pull it. The final twist of my story wasn't in what they lost. It was in what I chose not to reclaim. Closure isn't always a confrontation. Sometimes it's simply absence, not being there when they expect you to knock, not giving them the ending they rehearsed: tears, reconciliation, or some tearful thank you. I didn't owe them any of that. The next morning, I opened a new folder on my desktop. No labels, just a blank page. I started outlining a mentorship program, internal, anonymous, carefully structured, not for performance reviews or polished resumes, but for women like me, the ones who stay quiet because they were taught that loud ambition is dangerous, the ones who are still swallowing their ideas in meetings, still crediting others to survive. I didn't name it after myself. I didn't announce it in a company-wide email. I just built it. Carefully, quietly. And one by one, they found it, not through posters or HR campaigns, but through whispers, a nod in a hallway, a forwarded calendar invite, a handwritten note slipped beneath a coffee mug. It grew slowly, like all the most powerful things do. One afternoon, Layla stopped by my desk. She didn't speak, just handed me a folder and smiled. Inside were proposals from the next round of mentees. They were brilliant, sharp, strategic, and entirely unfiltered. I closed the folder and leaned back in my chair. This was the empire I wanted, not one built on ego, not one that needed to collapse to feel complete, but one crafted in the spaces between silence and strategy. One they'd never see coming because they were still looking for fireworks while I'd already mastered the slow burn. Later that year, Atria went public. Stock prices soared. I received an offer to join the board. No title, no ceremony. Just a seat at the table I helped carve with a scalpel instead of a hammer. I accepted, with one condition that the mentorship program remain untouched. No branding, no press, no interference. Just a protected corner of the company for women who understood the cost of restraint. They agreed. And so, I sat quietly at the highest level of the structure that once didn't have room for me, not out of revenge, but because I had simply become too valuable to ignore. There was no final applause, no cinematic music swelling as I walked into the boardroom for the first time. Just the sound of my own heels on polished floors and the low murmur of voices that paused just slightly when I entered. The kind of silence that doesn't ask for attention but commands it anyway. I took my seat. Not at the head, not in the shadows, just where I needed to be. Someone once told me that real success is invisible until it's irreversible. That no one notices the scaffolding until the building is finished. And by then, it's too late to question the architect. I used to think that meant hiding. Now I understand it means mastering timing, knowing when to speak, when to act, and when to wait until your presence says more than your words ever could. The board meeting opened. Numbers, projections, growth. There was talk of culture, how retention rates had stabilized, how women in leadership had doubled. Someone mentioned the mentorship program, called it an anonymous initiative that seems to be working. No one knew who started it. They didn't need to. I watched. I listened. I made notes in the margins. When it was time, I spoke, briefly, cleanly, and the room adjusted. That was the moment I realized something important. I hadn't just moved on from my old life, I had replaced it. Not with a louder version of myself, but with a sharper one. The kind that didn't need validation to know the damage she could do, and the discipline not to do it. After the meeting, Mark caught up with me in the hallway. "You're still quiet," he said. "Still listening," I replied. He nodded. "Good. They're louder now, but still not sharper." We parted without needing to say more. That night, I stood by my window and looked out at the city. The lights didn't blink any brighter. The world didn't lean in to say, "Well done." But inside me, something settled. Not peace, not triumph, just completion. The kind that only comes when you stop needing to be understood by the people who once misused your silence. I never reached back out to her, never replied to her last message, never visited the building again. Not because I was holding on to anger, but because I had finally understood the deepest form of power to walk away so completely that they have to rebuild their story without you in it. Let them. My story is mine now. And in the quiet corners of boardrooms and whispered mentorships, it echoes louder than any revenge ever could. It was raining the morning I received the letter. Not the kind of rain that pours, but the kind that lingers slow, deliberate, soaking into the cracks of the pavement like it knows what's buried beneath. I stood by my door, envelope in hand, the paper already slightly damp from where the mist had kissed it. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. I didn't open it right away. I made tea first, sat by the window, let the steam rise, curl, vanish. Only then did I slide my finger under the flap and unfold what would be the final words she'd ever send me. It was short, 3 lines, written in ink that had begun to fade. I used to think silence was weakness. Now I know it's what strength looks like when it has nothing left to prove. I hope you never break yours. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just folded the paper once, then again, and placed it on top of the letter she sent a year ago, the one in the drawer, the one I thought I'd forgotten. This one didn't feel like regret. It felt like surrender, not to me, but to the truth she'd avoided for too long. Some stories don't end with confrontation. They end with understanding, quiet, delayed, and unannounced. Later that day, I stood in front of a full room at an internal leadership session, no podium, no script. Just a circle of women, seated, listening. I told them nothing about what had happened. Instead, I asked one question. What would you build if no one could stop you? They were quiet at first. Then, one by one, they began to answer, not with noise, but with clarity, fire, tucked behind calm voices. And as I listened, I realized something simple, something profound. I was never the storm. I was the stillness before it, and that's why they feared me. That's why they tried to erase me. Because I wasn't chaotic. I was calculated. And the most dangerous woman in any room is the one who knows she doesn't need to prove she belongs there. She just listens, waits, and then builds the future no one saw coming. Thank you all for listening to my story until the very end. I hope that, even just a little, what I've shared can bring something meaningful to you. Goodbye, and see you again.